The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. In discussions about Native Americans in Florida, the first people mentioned are usually the Seminole. It wasn't until the 1770s, though, that the name Seminole was first used to describe the native people living here. Seminole means runaway or wild ones. Historians believe that Lower Creek Indians migrated to Florida in the 1700s and merged with Yamasee Indians, runaway slaves, and the few remaining indigenous people of Florida to form the Seminole tribe. What is less understood is that at the time of European contact centuries earlier, dozens of indigenous groups with sophisticated cultures occupied Florida. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. These 16th century engravings by Theodore de Bry, believed to be based on original artwork by Jacques Lemoyne, are the earliest images of Florida's indigenous people to be seen by Europeans. When Juan Ponce de Leon arrived in Florida in 1513, people had been living here for 10,000 years.
Well, we've got a number of archaeological sites or places where people were living, and we've got a whole sort of host of dating techniques that we can use now. And they all come back saying somewhere between 14 and 15,000. For most people, most archaeologists, it's a pretty solid interpretation.
14,000 or so years ago, it was much drier in Florida than now. Our sea levels were much lower. The water level in springs and rivers was much lower, or sometimes non-existent. And so the Indians and the animals would go to water holes, especially limestone bottom streams and sinkholes in North Florida to get water. And of course, that was a great place to hunt and to camp.
In the 1980s, working at the Page Ladson site in northwest Florida, James Dunbar helped to prove that people and mastodon coexisted in Florida nearly 15,000 years ago. Until then, most people believed that the Clovis culture from 13,000 years ago was the oldest in North America. Today, Dunbar's archaeological excavations in and around Wakulla Springs support his conclusions from the Page Madsen site.
We have a culture or cultures that were here prior to the time of Clovis, so it's older than we thought, let me put it that way, and because that now has been shown at Page Ladson, and I think we can show it now at Wakulla, now we have to fall back and say, okay, what's this culture about, and try to find, to the best of our ability, its cultural toolkit that they use to make everyday living and that kind of thing. And if we're so fortunate to find an underwater site that has their artifacts, we probably will also be able to find botanical remains, maybe even some genetic, those kind of things that you don't usually get on land. But the site combination of there's something right on land that's pre-Clovis, and there's something out there underwater that I think is going to be Clovis or pre-Clovis. It's exciting, say the least.
The Windover archaeological dig from the mid-1980s uncovered a remarkably well-preserved pond cemetery in east central Florida. 168 intact burials were discovered in an anaerobic peat bog. Carbon dating showed that the remains were between 7,000 and 8,000 years old, making them 3,200 years older than King Tutankhamun and 2,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. The carefully positioned skeletons were wrapped in the oldest woven fabric found in North America, and 91 of the skulls contained preserved brain matter. The perfect pH balance of the pond also allowed for the preservation of tools made of bone, antler, and wood. Glenn Doran was principal archaeologist for the Windover dig and explains that the artifacts discovered continue to be studied today.
The wooden tools are in some ways kind of unique, and if you talk to people who are wood specialists, they can even tell you what part of the tree was being used. So you become much more rapidly aware that these folks were pretty sophisticated in terms of their choices, in terms of what to make, how to make, what species to use. We also get some information in terms of diet from actual bone chemistry and tooth chemistry. So without skeletal material, you're left with projectile points and pots, and it's a little hard to get at some of that kind of information. The fabrics, are just absolutely amazing. That's one of the things that always blows people's mind, that, it is survived, and some of it's pretty darn sophisticated. We also have one of the earliest bottle gourds, Lagenaria ciceraria, from anywhere north of Mexico. We know they're out there in other places, but again, they just disappear in the archaeological record. So the large size, the really tight dating, the diverse array of materials is pretty phenomenal.
We can see that over those millennia since then, all the way up to the present day, the native societies have continued to change. People have left the state, others have come in, people have merged together, separated apart, and we know from archaeology that the native peoples of Florida have a very diverse and long history.
About 1,000 years ago, agricultural communities were established in what would become the southeastern and midwestern United States, and what is called the Mississippian world flourished. In addition to growing maize or corn, the Mississippian cultures were known for their construction of platform mounds on which they would build houses, towns, temples, and burial buildings. The largest chiefdom of the Mississippian world was in a ceremonial complex at Cahokia across the Mississippi River from modern-day St. Louis. The St. John's culture of northeast Florida roughly coincides with the Mississippian world. The St. John's period begins about 500 A.D. and continues until European contact 1,000 years later. Keith Ashley's research is demonstrating an extensive trade network between native Floridians and the thriving Mississippian culture.
So we're getting all these really minerals, stone, and metals that are kind of coming into Florida. And what's going out at the time is probably going to be things like coastal things that are exotic to landlocked people in Alabama or Missouri. Shells, whelk shells, bucicon shells, marginella shells, olive shells. Probably going to be things that are perishable, probably coastal Florida bird feathers, other types of things. Yopon holly, which they make the ceremonial black drink out of, is from a holly tree that grows really in the coastal plain area. So you see shark's teeth. So you see things that are everyday here in Florida are exotic to people in the interior, and they kind of want those things. So we probably see a lot of exchange going on and alliance building over great distances. And some of these exotic materials like copper and these finely finished pieces of copper like long-nosed god masks are probably part of these alliance ceremonies between groups that are a great distance apart. Because Cahokia being in the St. Louis, Missouri, East St. Louis, Illinois area, they really want things that are a great distance away, coastal resources. So they're probably securing alliances with groups in Florida to kind of secure these things.
We believe that at the time that Europeans first arrived here, Ponce de Leon in 1513, there were literally hundreds of individual Native American groups. We can call them tribes or polities or whatever. Over time, some of them had banded together. The Appalachee Indians up in the area around Tallahassee and Leon and Jefferson County were one well-organized tribe or group with elite leaders and priests and a hierarchy of officials, both religious and political, maybe 50,000 people. Here in parts of South or Central Florida and down in South Florida, you probably had some smaller groups in the interior. But then the Calusa on the southwest Florida coast, an extraordinary society.
The Key Marco cat is one of the most intriguing pre-Columbian artifacts found in Florida. The anthropomorphic, part feline, part human figure was created by the Calusa. The Key Marco cat is on display at the Marco Island Historical Museum in Southwest Florida on loan from the Smithsonian Institution.
Our knowledge of the Calusa is really based on the Spanish contact period. So we have to keep in mind that the window we're looking at is a biased one in the sense that we're only looking at one aspect or one period of time in the development of their culture. But at that time, they certainly were the elite, most powerful group in South Florida. And they had a relationship with other tribes that was essentially a tribute system. They were receiving lots of goods, and particularly during European contact, goods that were being salvaged from Spanish ships, things as simple as iron fasteners to even coins and treasure were making their way to the Calusa kingdom. And the cacique, which the chief of the Calusa, was very powerful in terms of affecting and influencing the policies of other tribes in South Florida.
Well, we know from Spanish documents that they did war with the Tocobaga in the Tampa area to the north, but they were very powerful by the time Europeans arrived in South Florida generally. They controlled at least 50 or 60 towns and demanded tribute from places as far away as the Florida Keys, Miami, Lake Okeechobee, and even influenced as far away as Cape Canaveral.
Well, the Calusa were basically a hunting, gathering, fishing culture. They were doing very well in South Florida because there they had the opportunities for all kinds of resources because of the abundance of marine life, including freshwater fishing, marshes, everything you can imagine in terms of habitat that really gave them a diversity of food sources. And what's really interesting about the Calusa, as well as other indigenous people of South Florida, is that South Florida and the Pacific Northwest of the United States are the only two places in North America where agriculture did not take a strong foothold. And that was because they had this tremendous amount of marine resources available.
In 1896, Frank Hamilton Cushing led an archaeological excavation on Marco Island, uncovering ancient artifacts of the Calusa. On display today at the Marco Island Historical Museum is a human face mask, an alligator figurehead, a painted shell, a carving of either a sea turtle or a bird, and the enigmatic 6-inch tall statue known as the Key Marco cat.
In 1895, W.D. Collier, who was a farmer and proprietor here on Marco Island, found in his muck pit out back, which he went to collect as fertilizer for his vegetable garden, he pulled out these artifacts that could have only been made by human hands. And so word quickly spread and eventually reached Cushing, who was at the University of Pennsylvania visiting his personal physician. And it was just pure coincidence. And one thing led to another, and Cushing came down later that year to investigate the site in person, knew immediately that he needed to do a full-scale excavation, and then returned the following year in 1896 with a team of professional excavators and an artist named Wells Sawyer to spend 3 months here on Marco Island excavating from the muck an extraordinary assembly of artifacts that ordinarily don't survive in archaeological sites.
The Key Marco cat is significant in part because it's simply an exquisite piece of art. Secondly, because it represents likely an important aspect of the cosmology of the Calusa and the idea that animals were important in terms of deities and totems in terms of the religious beliefs. The idea that animals particularly were key to survival in terms of, for example, saying a prayer to the deer totem before you would actually go out and kill a deer. All of this was important rituals in terms of daily life. There's no separation between religion and just secular life. Everything was a blend and intermingled.
We look at their art preserved from sites like Key Marco. We look at their artifacts in that. It's different than if I look at what you find up in northwest Florida from the Appalachia, or over here among the Indians that are known as the Ais, who lived along the Indian River and the coast in this area. So they shared some traits, but there are also distinct societies with their own specific ways of life and so forth. And interestingly enough, there are many, many different languages that were spoken in Florida, and that many of them seem to be, what we know about them, unrelated to other southeastern Indian languages that were spoken by the Creek or the Choctaw or the Cherokee.
The Calusa were skilled artists, politicians, and warriors. They successfully repelled Spanish attempts to colonize as early as 1521, mortally wounding Ponce de Leon when he tried to come ashore. The Tequesta lived directly across the Florida peninsula from the Calusa in what is now the Miami area. The best-known remnant of the Tequesta culture is the controversial Miami Circle.
The Miami Circle is an architectural structure characterized by cut holes in basins actually cut into the limestone. And these cut holes are the foundation for wooden posts supporting a circular structure. The Miami Circle is about 38 feet in diameter. There's no central post. In fact, none of the structures we found have a central post, so it suggests kind of an open hole in the middle of the ceiling, maybe to allow smoke to go out. In fact, we've never found evidence of charred pits in these structures, suggesting they were using fireboxes inside the structures. So those are some of the characteristics of life with the Tequesta in terms of the structures. And the Miami Circle was the first one found, and again created a lot of controversy, a lot of doubt, because coincidentally it coincided with a septic tank that was adjacent to the circumference, and it happened to be the septic tank was part of the Brickell apartments that had been built over the circle, which inadvertently had preserved it because it was a layer of fill over the top of the circle.
What's important that sometimes we forget about that site is the circle is one little thing, and that indeed in the 19th century people recognized that there was a huge complex of shell mounds, there were burial mounds, village areas, all on both sides of the mouth of the Miami River. The village that was known in the 16th century as Tequesta, and all that's left of this huge complex archaeological site is that little bit that's now preserved in the Miami Circle Park area. So whatever happens, we've preserved that. I think that's a good thing for the public and certainly for our understanding of the past.
On July 1, 1704, the Spanish and their Appalachee allies burned down Mission San Luis to keep it from being captured by the English. The native people and the Spanish had not always been friends, but by the early 18th century they were working cooperatively for their mutual benefit. Replicas of both Spanish and Appalachee structures from this period can be seen today at Mission San Luis in Tallahassee. Long before the Spanish first encountered the Appalachee in the early 16th century, the native people were already accomplished farmers.
So before contact, the Appalachee had established control over the region that exists between now what is Leon, Jefferson, Wakulla counties, stretching from the Osceola River in the east to the Ocklawaha River in the west, and probably north into what is now South Georgia. We know that they were, of course, an agricultural people, so they would have established large fields in which to grow their primary crops, corn, beans, and squash. We know from the DeSoto Chronicles when DeSoto encountered the Appalachee, they were living in fortified villages that probably had a stockade around them, and they would have supplemented their agriculture with hunting deer, bear, buffalo that lived in this area, and probably fishing along the creeks and along the Gulf.
The Appalachee focus on agriculture made them unique among Florida tribes. They also played a complex ball game that was carefully described in the writings of a Spanish friar at Mission San Luis.
The game was essentially a combination of our rugby and soccer, except you couldn't carry the ball, you had to kick it along, but it was very violent. You could tackle, bite, scratch, whatever you needed to do to stop the opponent from scoring. And the ball game was played to honor the god of thunder and god of rain. You played the game so that there would be rain for your crops. And the game was also very ceremonial. The night before the game, both teams would meet in the hosting village's council house, where they would celebrate. They would drink the casina, the black drink, to purge themselves of any impurities. And both teams kind of had a pep rally before the game. The ball players that were the best at the sport were held in high regard.
Clarence B. Moore was one of the first people to conduct excavations of Native American sites in Florida beginning in the 1890s. Moore was a wealthy Philadelphia socialite who inherited a lot of money, which allowed him to indulge his interest in the new field of archaeology.
He toured Africa, he toured Asia, and then he came back to Philadelphia, and he seemed to have gotten bored with Philadelphia's social life. So he decided to buy a series of little steamboats and excavate Indian mounds in Florida. So in the 1890s, he begins taking his steamboat. He had a series of them, but the one he's most kind of famous for is called the Gopher. And he would take that south down the St. Johns River, or really be up to St. Johns River since it flows north, and he would basically ask landowners, is there a strange kind of mound or a strange hill on your property? If so, can I dig it? So he would start digging Indian mounds, and he dug quite a few of them along the St. Johns River. He moved into other river systems in Florida. So for probably about a 25-year period, he would come down in the winter and excavate mounds throughout the southeastern United States.
The good thing that he did was every season he wrote up what he found, and he took wonderful photographs. He often kept the materials unless they were like shell tools or something he didn't want. But we have those materials today, the artifacts. We have his original notes, we have his reports. So we have a lot of information. On the other hand, if those sites still existed today and we dug them with the modern methods that we have, we would have learned a heck of a lot more.
By the time the English took control of Florida in 1763, most of the indigenous people had fled to Cuba, been enslaved, or succumbed to disease brought by the Europeans. As the last of the Apalachee, Timucua, Calusa, Tequesta, and other natives were leaving Florida in the late 1700s, the Seminole and Miccosukee people were moving in.
I think the most important thing to know is that they were here, and that we have to look at that legacy in a very positive way and embrace it, because this is not just a matter of looking at our own history and where we're from, whether it's from Cuba or from Boston. It's a matter of understanding that when we live at a place, it's the sense of place that's created by all the people who have been here.
At one time, we like to refer to the Seminoles as people who came in, but the Seminoles, back in the past, there was no Florida or Georgia or Alabama or anything. There was the Southeast, and the Seminoles are Southeastern Indians, and so their roots go back in time 14,000 years, just as long as we've had people in Florida and Georgia and Alabama.
I feel it's important to maintain our traditions because, I'm making things, they're not just objects. Those objects are carrying the knowledge and skills of, all of my ancestors. So there's a lot of things associated with it. So it's not just making a spoon. There's a lot more to it. There's, again, all these different traditional knowledges that are associated with these objects. And sometimes things have just what you call traditional protocol as well. There's, we have different rules and etiquette that go along with just about everything in Seminole culture, and so creating objects is not an exception to that.
A council house like this one in modern-day Tallahassee could accommodate a gathering of 1,000 people. Within a few centuries of European contact, there weren't that many Native Americans left in all of Florida. We can still recognize and commemorate their culture, though, at places like the Marco Island Historical Museum, the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and here at Mission San Luis. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime on the web at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brookmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
The Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. The Florida Historical Society Press publishes books on a variety of topics relating to our state's diverse history and culture. FHS Press titles include Life and Death at Windover, Excavations of a 7,000-Year-Old Pond Cemetery, The Voyages of Ponce de Leon, Scholarly Perspectives, Hollow Victory, a novel of the Second Seminole War, Stetson Kennedy's Palmetto Country, and Walk in Lawton. More information at fhspress.org.